If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Almitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
We often say those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But the guy who actually coined that phrase wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And that was a Spanish-American philosopher by the name of Jorge Agustin Nicolas Ruiz de Santillana y Borras. And that is my Spanish for the day. Welcome back, Equity Warriors, and thanks for tuning in to another episode focused on the intersection of education and politics here on the 3E Podcast. Now, today I want you to keep Santillana's actual sentiment in mind. If we cannot remember our true history, we are condemned to repeat it. We see that happening right now. If MAGA conservative push to erase our history, to substitute accurate works like the 1619 Project, and to eliminate responsibly sourced and edited texts created by educational publishing companies like Gibbs Smith, instead of allowing the lies and distortions contained in garbage propaganda that they're pushing into schools like PragerU, we, especially people of color, stand to remain entrenched in this systemic racism that plagues this country and is being shoved into our schools and our children's minds. About 4 years ago, there was this huge debate based on or because of the 1619 Project. Now, the project was a collection of essays, and its goal was to put the history of Black Americans and the impact of slavery front and center in our national story. Now, there were some people who had a few valid criticisms of the essays. Other folks, they were just complaining for the sake of complaining. But here's the thing. Those arguments and disagreements about the content in the 1619 Project, they didn't go away. And then after the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, there were some states controlled by Republicans that passed laws that limit what can be taught in schools about race and history. Some of these laws were very specific that said that teachers could not use any materials from the 1619 Project. Now, connection between that and the 2020 protests, well, the laws, all these new laws were part of a much larger concerted effort to stop young people, our children, from learning that racial discrimination against Black and brown people, especially Black people, is still a problem today. People who support those laws said that schools were brainwashing students with left-wing ideas and teaching things that weren't true. They argued that kids were being told that America was all about imperialism, greed, and racism. But hey, if the shoe fits, it's important that we remember that imperialism, greed, and racism are indeed parts of American history, important parts of American history. But some folks, especially some parts of the media, started saying that schools were talking about slavery too much. And that's just not true. Most schools in the U.S. actually don't talk enough about how slavery played a massive role in causing the Civil War, for example. Grab a high school history textbook and see just how much information is in it about slavery. And given that slavery was the primary agricultural and industrial engine in this country for more than half its existence, you would think it would get a little bit more than a paragraph. But again, some media outlets pushed a different idea, and that's what gave rise to this campaign to censor and change what's taught in our schools. Now, what was the long-term goal of all this fuss? Well, it had two parts. In the long run, some people wanted to make public schools look bad and eventually cut their funding. So what's happening in the state of Texas is a textbook example of that. In the short term, they want to teach history in a way that doesn't emphasize the problems of racial inequality in America's past or its present. They want to make it seem like there was never a reason for people to think racism existed or to protest or to make laws to fix the inequalities that both data and lived experiences and the injustices that are captured on cell phone videos that go viral on social media, what our own eyes tell us actually does exist. So this pushback against the 1619 Project started right after it came out. And I actually remember when it first came out listening to it as a podcast as I would take my daily walk. Now, there was a group of respected historians who had some concerns about one of the essays in the project, especially the part that said slavery was a big reason why the colonists wanted to break free from Britain. And they said that that idea was a bit exaggerated. So the author, Nicole Hannah Jones, changed the wording to say that some colonists held this view. Now, that's a more cautious statement and a common thing to do in research or research-based writings. This change was made in it to reflect the debate that continues among historians, but the main idea was about the author, Nicole Hannah Jones, her connection to her father's patriotism, despite America's history of racism, and that often got overlooked or misunderstood by people who were criticizing the project. Most of the other objections to the 1619 Project were about how it interpreted things like whether Black Americans had help from others in their struggle for freedom, whether the U.S. was founded on slavery, or if Abraham Lincoln really believed in Black equality. These were questions about how the project framed those ideas, and there's room for debate there. As for my quick take on Lincoln, any person who used the N-word, told racist jokes, said Black people were inferior to white people, who liked minstrel shows, who suggested ending slavery by shipping all willing Black folks back to Africa, and even once blamed enslaved Black people for starting the Civil War. I'm going to call it what it is. And don't even get me started on his views on Native Americans. So, yeah, the 1619 Project did spark some good conversations. It also got some over-the-top reactions. There was one person who compared it to how the Nazis took control of education in Germany. Not the goal. And then they use that same playbook, though, to infest schools with content from PragerU. There was another critic said it should have celebrated racial progress in America instead of focusing on its slow pace. You know, can't y'all just accept the crumbs we've given you? Wait your turn. But the project's main point, again, is how to show the legacy of slavery that still affects Black people today. So it's understandable why this ongoing fight for equality, rather than just being grateful for being in America, became the main theme. The most interesting part, the real controversy, is how after all these criticisms of the 1619 Project from that side, now we have those same states pushing to use materials from PragerU in schools. And the content from PragerU isn't just right-winged, it's extreme. It fails fact check after fact check. It is poorly sourced. The material there is not only inaccurate when it comes to history, there are gross distortions and outright lies. For example, there's this one video from PragerU that tries to make it sound like slavery wasn't that bad and that future generations don't need to feel sorry for it. There's another video that has Frederick Douglass saying something he never said about the end of slavery. So they're spreading a different version, a false version of history, a version that doesn't match the facts. That's not the same thing as the essays in the 1619 Project that people may just feel uncomfortable with, but are historically accurate. There are people who criticize the 1619 Project, or the people who criticize the 1619 Project and are now using PragerU materials. They want to push their own version of history. It's not about getting rid of propaganda or brainwashing. They just want to replace facts that make them uncomfortable with their racism with right-wing propaganda. They want to teach a whitewashed version of history from a far right-wing perspective, regardless of what the actual historical facts say. The intersection of politics and education. It's a busy and dangerous intersection. Some people would rather have our children learn things that aren't true if it supports their own political views instead of teaching facts. The hard history that might lead students who are critical thinkers to conclusions that are different from what those in power might want. Now, it was John Adams who said, "Facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. Always check the facts." Now, if you haven't done so and you have access, you can watch the 1619 Project on Hulu in the U.S., Star Plus in Latin America, or Disney Plus in all other U.S. territories. Outside of that, you'll need a VPN, or you can also find the original podcast on many podcast channels. Then, once you've listened and you know your facts, get involved, stay involved, and continue to join me every week. Connect with me on social, Facebook, LinkedIn, Threads, Insta, TikTok. Got a question you want answered? Send it to me by email at info@askdrberry.com, and I will answer your questions and bring you experts to help address those topics. And as always, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next time.
That's it for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 value private VIP day with Dr. Berry herself. Be sure to head over to 3epodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Dr. Berry's gift. Then join us on the next episode.